Hello, Bears fans. What is up? Welcome to the Bears Huddle podcast with me, your host, Aaron James, here in the UK, bringing you all your latest Bears news, views, and opinions. Guys, we're going to talk a little bit about Joe Thuney. Obviously, signed from the Kansas City Chiefs, looking like a one-year rental at this point, with his contract expiring at the end of this season and him becoming a UFA, an unrestricted free agent. Next off-season. We're going to talk about his contract situation. We're also going to talk a little bit and ask a question. Did Ben Johnson, in Orbert's name, call out DJ Moore and Cole Kmet with his recent comments post-draft and also his comments about turning up the dial on a couple of people within the building already? Did he see things last year when he was Lions offensive coordinator, when he played the Bears, that didn't impress him with DJ Moore and Cole Kmet? Guys, let's have a little look at that as well. Was there a bit of a shade thrown, a bit of a kick up the arse delivered to certain players within the Bears organization? We're going to start with that, but we're going to start with our new news about Joe Thuney. Joe Thuney is certainly someone who is an exceptionally talented guard, and a left guard, a real quality player, someone who has gone to Super Bowls, someone who has won Super Bowls. This is a guy who knows how to win. He's worked with some of the best coaches in the NFL. He's protected Patrick Mahomes. He's worked with one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL. Some people would argue the best quarterback in the NFL, and probably some people would argue the best quarterback of all time, although I would disagree wholeheartedly with that. Joe Tuni is certainly someone who contributes an awful lot, and people talk, don't they, a lot about someone's ability being their availability. That's a famous old quote, isn't it? About the best ability being your availability. And Tooney's certainly someone who, throughout his career has kind of always been available. If you could go right back to his rookie year in 2016, he played 16 games and started 16 games back when we had 16 game seasons. Again in 2017, 16 games completed. 2018, 16 games completed. 2019, 16 games completed. 2020, 16 games completed. In fact, the only year that he didn't complete his full roster of games was in 2022, when it was only 15. He only completed 15 games. The rest of the time he played every single game. So he's a guy who tends to avoid injury. He's a guy who tends to always be available. Look, I get and I understand that Thuney is not getting any younger, but in a position that does not rely on your speed, it doesn't really matter, I don't think. He's 32 years old, but I still think, there's at least another couple of years in Joe Thuney, and I think this is something that Ryan Poles has spoken about, and Poles has said that, the getting a contract done with Joe Thuney, an extension done with Joe Thuney, is certainly high up on his agenda. I mean, obviously the issues that we have at this moment in time are obviously around cap space. The latest information that I read regards the cap space is if we signed all our rookies tomorrow, we would be $3 million over the cap. So obviously, some cuts need to be made in the roster. Some money needs to be saved. Even before we, sign our rookies, before we can even start to think about new deals, new contracts. Obviously I know that Ryan Poles is very clever, and there are ways and means round these contracts. You can look at a situation where you start off with a very low salary and you then ratchet that salary up over time. That is obviously something you could do. You could also transfer a lot of salary into signing bonuses, etc., and kick the can down the road in terms of money. There is ways and means around this. We're fully aware of that. Now, Thuney's salary next year is estimated to be around 16 million, which is obviously very high for a offensive guard. Obviously debate will be then, what do you offer him? What would you be looking for a 33-year-old left guard? What would be a reasonable salary to pay him? Realistically, perhaps you're looking at a situation where that 16 million won't massively rise. That's not something that you would look to do. But I'm sure that whatever the Bears and Thuney can come to an agreement on, Ryan Pauls will do all he can to retain his man. Like I said, I don't think he sees this situation as a 1-year rental. He doesn't see this as being a short-term gig. I think he sees this as perhaps a 2-3 year thing where Thuney can come in. And also I think the fact that we have a number of now younger offensive linemen as well, the likes of Darnell Wright, obviously Luke Newman, Ozzy Trapilo. I think also, there's a hope there that Thuney can kind of be a mentor to them, can kind of help to develop them as offensive linemen. I know, obviously, they're tackles, those players, although Newman can play guard. He can play centre. He can play tackle. He can play all along the offensive line. So I think there's a hope there that Thuney can not only be a quality starter for the Bears for a couple of years to come, but also be someone who can mentor and develop those younger players that were brought in this draft. So, look, there is definitely an agenda there to give him a new contract. That is down to Ryan Pauls. When that deal gets done, I don't know. A lot of people have talked about it getting done before training camp or during training camp. I think a lot, again, depends on how they look at cutting players, how they look at moving money around, how they may restructure deals to create that cap space. Because, like I said, as it stands presently, if we signed all our rookies today, we would be $3 million over the cap. But Thuney's quality. He's a top guard, top player. Like I said, he's a player who hasn't suffered a great deal of injuries. That's probably jinxed him now. But certainly someone I think can really add to this team, and I think can do that for a good couple of years to come. Right, let's move it along a little bit now. Ben Johnson, he's obviously a guy who thinks very positively about the game. He's a motivator. He's someone who always demands the very best of his players. But I think, one thing that has kind of become evident in comments that Ben Johnson has made is that, whilst he's obviously this very positive, can do, we can do this, we can win, etc. kind of guy, and that, it's all about positivity with him, he still, I think, has a side to him. He certainly has a doesn't accept any shit from anybody kind of side to him, doesn't he? I think that is the way that we are looking with Ben Johnson. He certainly isn't a, like I said, a suffer fools gladly kind of guy. I mean, you don't get to be successful. You don't get to be a head coach in the NFL if you're that sort of person. Now, there's a few comments that he's made that have kind of been taken as been pointed cracks at certain individuals within the Bears organization already. Now, the first thing that was said, realistic, that we could look at, was a comment that he was made about the acquisitions in the draft of Luther Burden and Colston Loveland. Obviously, tight end Colston Loveland, who was the 10th overall pick, and is certainly someone who is exciting Bears fans in terms of his abilities and his talents. A guy who can line up as a tight end, can line up as a wide receiver, can line up as a slot receiver, can do a number of different jobs, which could obviously put into doubt some of the other players on this roster's futures. Adding to that as well, the acquisition of Luther Burden, who is a very, very talented wide receiver. Obviously on top of the Rome Odunze pick from last year, does that obviously put pressure onto DJ Moore? I do think so, especially as DJ Moore obviously is a top earner at within the team, and certainly someone who is only going to end up with a situation where his cap hit is going to get bigger and bigger, and maybe a situation that when it comes down to it, that the Bears look at it and decide, well, we can't really afford to pay Burden, Odunze and Moore. We've got to make choices, and maybe it's Moore that gets traded away. But Ben Johnson said, he did say, his comment was, I think we've turned up the dial a little bit on some of the people within the building, which obviously, kind of looked, when people looked and they kind of looked at who was drafted and when they were taken, you look at those guys and you look at the guy, obviously you look at the pick at pick 10, look at the pick at pick 39, and you kind of think, well, those guys are expected to be starters from day one. Those guys are expected to come into the team and obviously start straight away. So that, of course, begs the question of who misses out, who kind of, moves to one side. Now, I think, realistically, Ben Johnson does use a lot of 12 personnel. He's also a man who has 50% of the time lined up with 3 wide receivers. So obviously that means that there is opportunity to obviously put Luther Burden, DJ Moore, and obviously Rome Odunze out there. And I think Rome will have a very big year this coming year. The 12 personnel thing obviously allows Cole Kmet and Colston Loveland to both be on the field at the same time. Yes, I know Durham Smythe is around, but I don't think he's going to be someone who particularly troubles the scorers, if I'm being honest with you. he said, we've obviously notched up a couple of dials on certain people within the building. He says, so that is a good thing. That's healthy, and he's already spoken about the fact there is no depth chart within the organisation at this point in time. There is nobody there that is obviously guaranteed a spot. Now, like I said, a lot of this has been taken as perhaps a hint at DJ Moore and to a lesser extent Cole Kmet. He talked about the fact that, we have a lot of weapons. And so how are you going to basically use all of those? So he asked this question. He said, how are you going to run your route when you might not be number one in the progression? Okay. You got to do those things right. How are you going to block for your teammate when he has the ball? Because if you don't do those things right, then as a coaching staff, we are going to want to get the ball to you a little bit more. So it all ties together. But the fact that he very pointedly said, how are you going to run your route? How are you going to block? A lot of people have taken this as a kind of veiled criticism of DJ Moore. One of the things that was levelled at DJ last year was that when he wasn't the target, when he wasn't the man who was going to get the ball, he didn't run his route as hard. He didn't put as much effort in, which kind of told the opposition that it wasn't going to be him that got the ball and enabled them to zero in a little bit more on who was going to get the ball. The DJ Moore's that lack of effort was kind of a lack of professionalism to some degree, and certainly not something that Ben Johnson will like or will want to see from DJ Moore going forward. So, like I said, is this a little bit of a pull your finger out, DJ Moore? Start performing as we know you can perform consistently all the time. Don't be that lazy individual. Don't be that player that only goes half cocked, most of the time. That is not what we want to see. And I think, like I said, this challenge that Ben Johnson issued, like I said, it was very interesting that he used the example of how do you run your route, how do you block, as that example. And that's why I think a lot of people have kind of looked at this and taken it as being DJ Moore, that Ben Johnson is kind of throwing the challenge down to, throwing the gauntlet at and calling him out a little bit. In terms of DJ Moore, and this is a guy who this year will earn $20.6 million. Next year will earn $23.4 million. The year after that, $23.4 million. So his salary is going to continue to rise. And, maybe a situation that we look at it in a couple of years' time, or say a year's time, and say, well, look, we realistically can't afford him. We want to continue to get younger. Roma Dunze and Luther Burden are the future. We pay them. We certainly don't. We certainly look to sort of trade off DJ Moore. So DJ obviously has had a bit of a wake up call, a bit of a kick in the balls, really, kind of a sort yourself out, buddy. You could be a weapon. You could be someone who really thrives in this Ben Johnson offense, but you need to play your part. You need to be a team player. And I think, to some extent, Cole Kmet, can Cole take that bit of a backward step? He's a 100% of the time kind of guy, but, I think there's a situation where you can look at having Colston Loveland on the field between 40 to 50% of the time as well. He's clearly very highly rated by the Bears coaching staff. And, whilst I don't think, as some people do, that Cole will be traded away at this stage, it may be a long-term thing, perhaps 12 months down the line, but I don't think for this season he will be. I think, there's certainly within the organisation there is a view that Loveland and Kmet can be used together, and they have varying different roles within the team. Loveland looks a guy, doesn't he? He looks a player. Interesting comment again today from Ian Rappaport that there were talks about trading up, in the first round until the Bears took Loveland at 10. Then all those phone calls went quiet, pretty much dropping hints that there was a lot of teams below the Bears who also had a desire to pick Colston Loveland. Like I said, I think this guy is a talent. He's certainly a player who I think can make a big difference. Even if he's a poor man's Travis Kelce, he's still going to be one hell of a player. Guys, let me know your thoughts in the comments on the stories we've covered in the video this evening. Thank you for watching the Bears Huddle podcast. On your way out, please like, comment, share and subscribe, and let's bear down. See you later, Chicago. One love.